Dugin's directive, the conflict in the Middle East, is the start of a great war. Alexander Dugin argues that the escalating conflict in the Middle East marks the beginning of a larger global war, as Iran and its allies confront Israel and the Western hegemony, opening a second front following Ukraine. The missile strikes by Iran on Israel are a natural step from the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is a response to Israel's prior actions against Lebanon's Hezbollah, including the assassination of its leader Sheikh Sayed Hassan Nasrallah and Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh killed in Tehran, as well as the genocide of civilians in Gaza. It is hard to say whether the hundreds of Iranian missiles have hit their targets because, as in all military conflicts, both sides tend to hide the true situation. However, it must be noted that the war in the Middle East, which many experts predicted as inevitable, has already become a reality. The second front in the confrontation between the rising multipolar world and Western hegemony is now open. The first front is Ukraine, the second is the Middle East. For a long time after Israel's invasion of Gaza and the start of the mass genocide of civilians, Hezbollah hesitated to enter the war directly. Iran also delayed serious action, attempting to find common ground with the West through its new president. However, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei decided to launch a massive missile strike on Israel. The escalation has taken a new step. Israeli troops have invaded southern Lebanon. The shelling of Beirut and the entire territory of Lebanon has become the norm. Another front will undoubtedly open for Israel in Syria. I also believe Iraq will increasingly be drawn into the anti-Israel coalition, given that Iraq's population and government are predominantly Shiite. Therefore, the Great War in the Middle East can be considered underway. But what is the balance of power in this war? Clearly, Israel has a significant technological advantage. As long as technology decides everything, Israel remains the strongest side of the conflict, even compared to the well-armed Hezbollah in Iran. Yes, Hezbollah's leaders have been eliminated. Yes, it has suffered enormous losses after Israeli intelligence operations. Yes, the West supports Israel. Nevertheless, we must not underestimate the vast numerical superiority of the Axis of Resistance forces over Israel. Once the situation within Israel reaches a breaking point, with the Palestinian population over 2 million Palestinians within Israel itself, plus more than 4 million in the two Palestinian territories, the situation will become critical. Of course, the West can help Israel intercept missiles and launch strikes. But what can be done with this sea of Arabs that has faced genocide in Gaza and is being systematically and cynically destroyed by Israel within its territory, violating all norms of warfare? I believe we are nearing a true explosion of Arab anger against Israel, which cannot be contained for much longer. Gradually, this war will take on an even broader character. And it must be said that this situation benefits Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. He and his far-right cabinet, which includes ministers from the radical religious Zionist faction such as Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, have the eschatological goal of creating greater Israel. Netanyahu's government operates under the assumption that it has a messianic credit, believing the arrival of the Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah, King of the Jews who will subjugate all nations to the Jewish people, but is perceived as the Antichrist or Dajjal by Christians and Muslims as near. Thus, the war with the Arabs is seen as sacred by religious Zionists, followers of Rabbi Kukan Dov Bir Levi Soloveitchik, who in the mid-20th century blessed the seizure of Arab lands for the creation of Greater Israel, or by modern rabbis like Dov Ulier, who promotes similar views. Its culmination should be the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and the beginning of the construction of the Third Temple, where the Jewish Mashiach is to reign. At the same time, there is an eschatological mobilization of the Islamic population in the region, especially the Shiites. Thus, the situation will only intensify. Religious Zionists believe that they can hasten the coming of their Mashiach through radical and aggressive actions in the Yom Kippur War. Although a significant portion of Israel's population is secular and does not believe in this, organizing mass protests against Netanyahu, asking we were living fine in a democratic society, and now suddenly there's this strange and terrifying war blaming Netanyahu for what is happening. Thus, the war with the Arabs is seen as sacred by religious Zionists, followers of Rabbi Kukendov Bir Levi Soloveitchik, who in the mid-20th century blessed the seizure of Arab lands for the creation of Greater Israel, or by modern rabbis like the Avilier, who promote similar views. Its culmination should be the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the beginning of the construction of the Third Temple, where the Jewish Mashiach is to reign. At the same time, there is an eschatological mobilization of the Islamic population in the region, especially the Shiites. Thus, the situation will only intensify. Religious Zionists believe that they can hasten the coming of their Mashiachs through radical and aggressive actions, a new Yom Kippur war. Although a significant portion of Israel's population is secular and does not believe in this, organizing mass protests against Netanyahu, asking we were living fine in a democratic society, and now suddenly there's this strange and terrifying war blaming Netanyahu for what is happening. However, in the Islamic world, there is also a strong position in favor of escalation, with Shiites being the most prepared for an eschatological scenario. Israel, the Zionist regime, is seen as the servant of the Dajjal Antichrist who must be fought. For most ordinary Muslims, this is simply a war for survival, an ethnic war. In Gaza, Israel is conducting ethnic cleansing, killing tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of peaceful Palestinians. Thus, how events will unfold is difficult to predict. It is clear that for the Biden administration, this is a highly unpleasant situation, diverting attention from Ukraine, whose support has quickly become secondary. It is also a blow to the global economy, as Iran could block the Strait of Hormuz at any moment, affecting vital trade routes. Additionally, there is the activity of the pro-Iranian Houthis in Yemen, in the Red and Arabian Seas, and even in the Indian Ocean. This presents a grim scenario for the current U.S. administration, while also creating an opportunity for Trump, a supporter of religious Zionism and an apologist for Netanyahu. As a result of the escalation in the Middle East, the entire world is being shaken. This is the main consequence of the beginning of the Great War. But what position should Russia take in this situation? It is, of course, a very delicate question. On the one hand, Israel is not our enemy. On the other hand, Iran, the Yemeni Houthis, Hezbollah, the Syrians led by Bashar al-Assad, and the Iraqi Shiites are our friends and strategic allies. Our strategic partners, who have largely supported Russia in its confrontation with the West over Ukraine, are now fierce enemies to the death of a country with which Russia has neutral relations. But considering that behind Israel stands the globalist West, the same forces that support our direct enemies in Ukraine, the Kiev junta, a very complex geopolitical model emerges. This puts the Russian leadership in a dilemma. On the one hand, we seem to be moving towards fully supporting the forces of the axis of resistance in their struggle, not so much against Israel itself, but against the collective West that supports it. On the other hand, Putin, though to a lesser extent than Trump, feels a certain closeness to Netanyahu's right-wing policies, his desire for a stronger state, and his defense of traditional for Jews values. However, this Israeli policy is not close enough for us to go against our own geopolitical interests. We see that the stance of the Russian foreign ministry and the Kremlin leans towards supporting Iran, the Shiites, Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, and Iraqis, and openly opposing the global West. But at some point, we will also have to take a position regarding Israel. We cannot forget that some right-wing Zionists in Russia have supported Moscow in the Ukrainian conflict. This is also an important factor, but will it outweigh our geopolitical alliance with the forces of the axis of resistance? The question remains open. In my view, Russia's attitude towards Israel will be significantly reassessed, leading to a notable cooling of relations. Lacan and psychedelic Trumpism. Alexander Dugin applies Lacan's three orders to us politics, arguing that while Kamala Harris and the Democrats seek to dismantle traditional structures, psychedelic Trumpism influenced by figures like Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel, and J.D. Vance, alongside the alt-right, counters from the right, with a warning that a Harris victory could spell the end of humanity. Lacan's method. Let us try to apply Lacan's topology to the American elections. Let us recall Lacan's basic model. It can be represented as three Borroman rings or three orders. the real, the symbolic, the imaginary. The real is the domain where every object is strictly identical to itself. This absolute identity excludes the very possibility of becoming, i.e., of being in a state of transformation. Thus, the real is the zone of pure death and nothingness. There are no changes, movements, or relations. The real is true, like the truth of nothingness that has no alternatives. The symbolic is the domain where nothing equals itself, where one thing always refers to another. It is an escape from the real, motivated by the desire to avoid death and falling into nothingness. It is here that content, relationships, movements, and transformations are born, but always in a dreamlike state. The symbolic is the unconscious. The essence of a symbol is that it points to something other than itself. It does not matter what specifically, as long as it is not itself. The imaginary is the domain where the dynamic of the symbolic stops, but without the object dying and collapsing into the real. The imaginary is what we mistakenly take for being the world, ourselves, nature, society, culture, and politics. It is everything, yet it is also a lie. Every element of the imaginary is actually a frozen moment of the symbolic. Wakefulness is a form of sleep that does not realize itself. Everything in the imaginary refers to the symbolic but presents itself as supposedly real. In the real, A is true. In the imaginary, A is false. In the imaginary, no object is identical to itself, but unlike in the symbolic, it doesn't want to admit this neither to itself nor to others. The real is nothing. The symbolic is ever-changing becoming. The imaginary consists of false nodes of the frozen symbolic. Lacan and politics. Lacan was well aware that the model of the three orders cast doubt on the basic strategies of reformism, progressivism, and revolution. It is no coincidence that in his youth he was right-wing and a monarchist close to Charles Maurras. And in the 1960s, contrary to the New Left, he supported the status quo and de Gaulle's rule. This was no accident, but stems directly from the Borromean rings model. The New Left revolutionaries in Lacan's interpretation wanted to replace the imaginary old social political structures, order as such with the symbolic, surreal, schizophrenic, transgressive. They used Lacan's ideas in a utilitarian way. Ironic Freudianism helped undermine the claims of the imaginary order to foundational logic, revealing it as merely a frozen moment of delirium. However, they overlooked the fact that once the old imaginary collapses or melts under the pressure of critique, whether political, aesthetic, social, or epistemological, the symbolic cannot take its place. It will instantly become the new imaginary, equally totalitarian, dictatorial, and absurd. Examples of this Lacan saw everywhere, especially in Soviet Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks began with a call for freedom and equality, but quickly transformed into a rigid party hierarchy with a totalitarian apparatus of violence. The same happened with Cromwell or the French Revolution. The symbolic retains its properties only while remaining in the unconscious, in the realm of dreams. The moment it surfaces, it turns into the imaginary, essentially the same thing, though now dressed in new forms. All imaginary systems were once symbolic, alive, and changing before freezing into permanence. Thus, today's revolutionary is tomorrow's totalitarian, cruel official and enforcer of violence. Reforms in the context of the Borromean rings are impossible, as they will lead to the same result. The symbolic can never replace the imaginary under any conditions. Lacan believed this, and this conclusion flows directly from his system, Kamala Harris in the symbolic. Now to the U.S. elections. Here we see a fierce clash between progressives Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party, and conservatives Trump and the Republicans. In Lacanian analysis, the roles seem obvious. Kamala Harris embodies an invitation to transgression, the legalization of perversions, and liberation from all prohibitions and norms, i.e., the expansion of the symbolic realm. The Democrats' platform is a structure of well-tempered delirium: more LGBT, more cancel culture, more illegal immigrants, more drugs and gender reassignment surgeries, more deconstruction of old orders, more BLM and critical race theory. Of course, the main imaginary being mocked and attacked from all sides is Donald Trump, the generalized archetype of unfreedom, hierarchies, and male rationality. Kamala Harris represents the symbolic, as seen in her strange speeches, endless cold and meaningless laughter, her incoherence, and her expressive gestures that point to something intuitively understandable but indefinable. Harris is a figure of active dreaming. The voter sees in her that the impossible becomes possible, and one thing seamlessly flows into another, but everything remains unfocused and blurry. This is progress. Whites become blacks, capitalists become something else, loot the stores, that's the whole law. Men and women become vague objects of desire, Lacan's little a, always evading fixation. In other words, despite Lacan's own warnings about the unchanging structure of the Borromean rings, the Democrats are actively trying to destroy the American imaginary, fervently wanting to replace it with the symbolic. Psychedelic Trumpism and right-wing dreaming. Where can we find a counterattack on the frozen liberal imaginary which has turned into overt totalitarianism? The answer is obvious in the opposite pole, which we can call Trumpist symbolic. We saw the signs of this strategy during Trump's first presidential campaign in the alt-right, on 4chan, in the figure of the meme Pepe the Frog, in reptilian conspiracy theories, chaos magic, and the delirious theories of QAnon. We might call this esoteric Trumpism, or more precisely, psychedelic Trumpism. If the Democrats and their transgressive practices have become the imaginary frozen in totalitarian prescriptive power structures, then psychoanalytic critique from the symbolic has naturally focused on the Republicans. Of course, not all Republicans, but the most liberated, unhinged, and delirious factions. Here we encounter an interesting picture. The power held by the Democrats and the neoconservative wing of the Republicans places them as carriers of the imaginary, that is, the globalist order. However, progressivism is a synonym for the symbolic clashes with the totalitarianism entrenched in the Democrats, who fiercely cling to power. Even though the Democrats' narrative depicts the imaginary as Trump the tough, feminine Melania, the Republicans, and old liberal America in the larger system, it is the Democrats who now embody the imaginary, desperately holding on to power. Kamala Harris is an agent of a rigid, organized system, what is called the deep state. She is not an organism but a mechanism, a link in the vertical chain of authority. This is how the imaginary order manifests itself. Appeals to the symbolic only slightly obscure its true nature. The only critique capable of identifying and destabilizing this frozen order comes from psychedelic Trumpism, which increasingly assumes the function of the symbolic. This analysis helps explain the selection of J.D. Vance as a potential vice president, or even Trump's successor in his ideological battle against the liberal establishment. Vance no longer represents the imaginary but the purely symbolic. He openly aligns himself with the extravagant, psychedelic field of post-liberal right-wing thought, especially the chaotic alt-right universe. Figures like Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, and the brilliant French philosopher René Girard, who wrote on sacred violence, are atypical for classic right-wing Republicans. They cannot be used to illustrate the imaginary which the progressives supposedly aim to dismantle in the name of the symbolic. In Vance, the Democrats' psychoanalytic strategy fails, as Vance himself embodies the atypical right-wing symbolic pole. It is even possible that he understands this and is familiar with Lacan. Thus, choosing Vance as vice president is a key move in Trump's campaign. Once again, the magic of chaos represented by the Borromean rings and their connection to dreamlike psychedelia comes into play, but this time more systematically. Strictly following Lacan, the Trump-Vance alliance seems harmonious and full of promise. Trump himself offers the imaginary that appeals to the right-wing electorate. But this is complemented by right-wing postmodernism, social critique, and the liberating delirium embodied in psychedelic Trumpism and, by extension, Vance. The rational daytime mode of governance, inevitable in any administration and transparent in Trump's case, is balanced by the nighttime mode of liberated right-wing dreaming. Transgression from the right. Curtis Yarvin. A conversation about monarchy. One David Volodsko, whom I know not otherwise, but who writes about communism, fascism, and radical movements, and who was apparently fired by the Seattle Times for improperly comparing Hitler to Lenin, skillfully earning the ire of both fascists and progressives, cold emailed and requested an exchange of open letters. Here is his. Volodsko, one of many fine recovering journalists in America, seems to have his head screwed on tight with limits. He can stand an impressive amount of contemporary small arms fire, but he is not yet fully armored. When he takes on heavy words like monarchy and slavery, he pops his turret. Like a leopard driving over a TM-62. Still, his heart is in the right place, and we wish him well as a fellow traveler on the long and stony road to truth. Are we there yet? I cannot at this time post my full response to Volodsko. Hopefully at some point it will become available. Thank you, dear readers, for your patience in this cold, dry winter of content. Things are happening. There will be more interesting stuff soon, but let me respond to a couple of points. The CEO, the king, and the president. Volodsko has a genuinely substantive question about monarchy. He wonders what I mean by all this stuff. Do I mean what I am saying? I do, so let me be really explicit, which I'm usually not, about what I mean. But are you playing word games? One of the reasons I wanted to speak with you was to discover the answer. Are you describing a dictator or a king? Or are you describing a CEO or a president? And simply using words like monarch because they're clickbait. Why doesn't unitary executive theory solve the problem for you? Or if you support a king who is elected to 4-year terms, as you have said that you do, why do you object to a president? Why not advocate for a more powerful president? After all, you argue that nations should be run like startups and their leaders should be like CEOs. Is a president not more like a CEO than a king? In theory, yes, I do advocate for a more powerful president, but unitary executive theory is a confusing way to say this, despite its correct literal meaning. As a buzzword, as a brand, it has spent too much time in the mouths of people who do not actually mean it. Until this unitary executive is so much more powerful than the present office that the president considers both the judicial and legislative branches purely ceremonial and advisory with the same level of actual sovereignty as Charles III today, the unitary executive will not work. In any supposedly balanced regime which is somehow made out of the government we have now, the executive will not be unitary. It will just pretend to be. We already have a pretend executive, so why care? So that no one, including David Volodsko, is confused, let me explain clearly and exactly what a realistic monarchical transformation in the U.S. means and looks like. You can be confident that anyone in D.C. you hear talking about a unitary executive is not talking about this regardless of the literal meaning of the words. Our administrative regime, or the Congress and the court, what comes around goes around. After a century in which Article I and Article I reduced Article I to ceremonial status, it is now their turn in the barrel. The wisdom of the founders in allowing the anaclosis cycle to operate by failing to specify the precedence of the branches is once again confirmed. Ambiguity in a sovereign contract, no contract at all, since no superior power enforces it, is an intentional loophole through which contingent history can squeeze any of the branches. I can ascend to sovereignty over the others without violating the letter or even the spirit of the Constitution. As FDR said in his first inaugural address, this document has lasted so long because it is so flexible. The real end of executive authority is the replacement of arbitrary command by legislative process administration by administrative law. An executive under law is not an executive at all. We are living in the Babylonian captivity of Article I, which can only be ended by a radical and unconditional act of executive restoration and American reassertion of the ancient English rule that the king is above the law. Again, the Constitution does not specify the precedence of the branches. Over the last century, the Article I branch has been marginalized, while individual presidents, mainly FDR, but also Wilson and LBJ, have exerted true executive authority. These reigns of power have been increasingly informal, irregular, and exceptional. Look at the past. The control of the White House over the so-called executive branch has only dwindled over the century. How different is D.C. in practice today from the structure Wilson himself described in congressional government? We don't have an executive branch. We have an administrative branch, the creature of the Article I and Article I branches. The root of this branch is the exceptional in the sense of Carl Schmitt decision of Madison v. Marbury 1803, in which Article I seized sovereignty by a successful act of arbitrary power. History squeezes in. Again, the founders designed their system to be arbitrary at the highest level, a concession to the wise, subtle, and permanent principle that might makes right. For in what other way was right ever made? Might have to make it, or no one will. Duh. However the present came to be, it is what it is. Now and for the foreseeable future, either this administrative regime is absolutely subjected to the arbitrary discretion of the president, or there is no real president, which means there is no real election. Because nothing can change what the real Washington has long since become, the only power remaining to the American people is to either dissolve or endorse it. Any future presidential election under this system, therefore, is either plenary or nugatory. Perhaps at some future date we could again experiment with a mixed government of checks and balances or something again. Today, in the real world we live in, there are only two real political choices before us: eternal bureaucracy or elective monarchy. Again, as anyone inside the Beltway who is smarter than a golden retriever knows, there is no executive branch, there is an administrative branch. Legally, under our system of entirely factitious and increasingly comical constitutional law, which in turn hath begat administrative law, the article II voters might well elect Charles III. Our administrative branch is entirely the creature of Articles I and I, the judicial and legislative branches. It is no surprise that this weird hybrid mutant has failed. The administrative branch is run according to a process dictated not by the president, but by the Congress and the courts. This process was set down long ago in what some have called America's real Constitution. I refer not to the Civil Rights Act of 1965, but the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. The APA completes the transition from the quasi-executive FDR wartime regime to the post-war oligarchic bureaucracy. The monarchy to oligarchy transition is not unusual when a monarch dies without a strong successor. Is it reversible? Yes, nothing in political science is forever. No empire is forever, etc. What it is not, however, is incrementally reversible. No one who knows Washington could even conceive of subjugating it to the personal authority of a single executive, and the wisest policy for any such executive would be to dissolve and replace it. Since Joe Biden was a little boy, the budget, policy, organization, and personnel of the executive branch, and even of the White House itself, have been micromanaged by the other two branches. It is impossible to imagine the resulting administrative branch in any way returning to real executive control. Don't bother, just build a new government. The process has simply eaten all significant executive discretion of the president, leaving only a few hackneyed, predictable, totally reactive issues and decisions to occupy the day in the TV cameras. Indeed, for someone who has so little actual impact on the world around him, the president is remarkably busy. He himself does not generally notice that he has no power, especially if he is a Democrat, and flows with the power. Although the impact of elections in either direction is marginal, an effective Democratic presidency is still a political brake on all the craziest stuff the agencies want to do. It is true that outside his numerous ceremonial duties, the president makes decisions, deciding exceptional cases which lower levels of the hierarchy cannot or do not wish to process by their rules is the role of managers in a process-based bureaucracy. But making decisions is not an executive function. It is a reactive function. The maker of mere decisions does not decide the exception, he decides what to do with an exception, not when to make an exception. And he certainly does not decide what the rule is. Deciding what the rule is must be left to some inexorable historical or collective process meant to be mechanical and above mere human judgment, even if it just means accepting past patterns and events as sovereign precedents. The process is either inexorable and sensible, or inexorable and deranged, or in fact steered by mere human beings under the covers for reasons that are either sensible or deranged. Grasping the sovereign wand. To escape the sickening, ever-growing coils of DC's Gordian knot, American voters have only one realistic option. They need to elect a president who clearly states his intention and preparedness to take over the entire American government, assuming plenary power, not just in response to any specific event or emergency, but immediately upon his inauguration when his democratic authority is at its strongest. This isn't even unprecedented in American history, not even in the lives of those now living. Read FDR's first inaugural, specifically the part where he demands the powers of a general resisting an enemy invasion. And in 1933, these were the powers FDR needed to create what, during his informal dictatorship for life, was more or less his personal executive monarchy, then after his death became the formalized administrative state. To dismantle this vast and ancient growth, the vacant throne of FDR is not even enough. Today, the powers of the general resisting an enemy invasion are insufficient. No, the new president will need the powers of the enemy general? Why fuck around? Haven't we done enough fucking around? Do we like it fucking around? Is it fun? Americans now see the Gordian knot. Either we cut it, or we pluck ineffectually at a thread or two. Boomers, RFK Jr. voters, awake. Join us. Can't you see that the whole government hates you and has for your whole life? Put down the bong and tie back your gray ponytail. We're going to DC. This time we're going to create change. We're tired, we Americans declare, of gooning it every 4 Novembers to the likes of George Bush, Barry Obama, or John McCain. We're even done with endless edging for America's funniest professional frontmen. Having fully abandoned the sin of Onan, we shall not cast our political seed upon the ground. We mean our votes to count. We have no confidence at all in our present institutions, and we, the people, who art sovereign, appeal to high heaven, and do solemnly declare this a bareback election. The birthday girl is due for a historic surprise. In the bareback election, if our candidate wins, we expect him to take full power. We trust in God to guide him. If the other candidate wins, we implore him to do the same. Maybe God will guide him too. If not, surely the Lord has some other plan. But we think he wants us to have one too. In case you're too afraid of the wrath of God, 2024 will not be a bareback election. No, it will be an ordinary American show election. So you have more than 4 years. The bareback president makes exactly one promise: he will hold himself accountable to the people who elected him by holding a free and fair national election in 4 years. In all other matters, he will exercise unconditional executive authority over the whole American government. This, for him, will be the Constitution for the next 4 years. By voting bareback, the American electorate collectively decides that its country is in a state of emergency. They declare that this administrative regime has failed and lost their confidence, along with the sovereignty they had delegated to it. They reassume their full sovereignty and delegate it unconditionally to a rebooted Article I branch, the bareback president. The first job of our new constitutional executive branch is to entirely liquidate the old unconstitutional administrative branch, not to reform the state, nor to eliminate the state, but to replace the state while it is running, without any turmoil or disorder. While not easy, this is easier than most people think. A bareback election elects a bareback president. He is not just more powerful, he is orders of magnitude more powerful, at least in his authority over the executive branch. As Stalin observed, quantity has a quality all its own. To obtain the people's consent to true plenary authority, then use it to drive any plan that could have been executed at much lower power levels is mere incompetence and will certainly fail. That would be yet another case of fishing in the Rubicon. Granted real executive power, why on earth would a new president keep the existing executive branch? These organizations are not habitually used to being directed by him, but rather by policies, processes, budgets, personnel, even principles mandated by the Congress. The new management of FTX might as well keep the old traitors. The new president will not just theoretically claim the powers of a conquering enemy general. For these powers to make sense, he needs to govern like a conquering enemy general, using direct command of the police to maintain public stability as he spins up a totally new executive branch, run like a startup with startup quality people. The new president will not, of course, just change the policies of the new regime. He would not even just replace the personnel security forces excluded of the old regime. Radical as they might seem, these measures are wholly inadequate. It is not even enough to dissolve the organizational structures of the old regime or even demolish its physical buildings. Any new regime worthy of the name will need to be ready to rewrite even its philosophical principles. The new president will not just take over the federal government, but also state, local, and tribal government. Moreover, as long as he finds any organization, public or private, to have become a de facto state agency, he will nationalize and restructure it. Also, he is likely to discover many new problems that the government isn't solving but should be. And this new infrastructure will run at or near startup efficiency. It must be run like Apple, not like the Department of Transportation. If this is what a unitary executive means, I am all for a unitary executive. But when I hear people saying unitary executive and I listen to the other things they are saying, it sounds like they mean something different. That's why all I want for my birthday is a bareback president. The transition program. A new president who is not immediately ready for unlimited regime change will fail. His potential powers will evaporate rapidly after his inauguration as he falls into the bad old groove of a ceremonial presidency. The transition must begin as soon as he steps off the inaugural stage. The preparation for the transition must have begun months at least, and years ideally before that day. There are all sorts of organizational tools that can be prepared in advance to make our great nation's first bareback inauguration since 1933 go as smoothly as possible. Signaling the sovereignty of the new regime is especially important. There is a reason that the classical 20th century coup heads straight for the TV tower. A regime change must first become visible. It must feel like an earthquake, in which power structures which previously seemed as immovable as mountains shake or crumble into dust. The new regime is far more real than the old, and it must immediately make this known. Yet the entire transition must remain orderly. Is there a huge difference between life in the public and private sectors? One big company is going out of business, another is being founded. No one is being dragged away and shot. It is not the 20th century. At most, a week of COVID-style lockdown should be enough to secure the new regime. Not only are the Americans of today, especially the blue state ones, no Minutemen, but unlike most historical urban populations, they do not even know how to be a mob. Today, civilian numbers are as irrelevant to contests of force as in the 13th century. 21st century Americans are a civilized people. We do not chimp. Let's go through some critical steps in a real 21st century regime change. Here is what a real unitary executive would do if he was a real dictator on the first day. Libs, if you are used to squeaking fearfully about far-right conservatives, this very reasonable and if anything mild program will make your prostate gland quiver. And yet nobody needs to get shot or even thrown out on the street. While there are many things to say against a government running on a soft currency, the power to print money sure makes it easy to run a regime change. All the civil soldiers of the old regime, and there are a lot of them, can be severed very gently from their positions. Arbitrary level of structural change can be achieved without severing any heads, even metaphorically. The new president is as ruthless as Stalin, yet as nice as Jimmy Carter. The faster the transition process proceeds, the better. Intermediate states of power are dangerous and ineffective. The old regime must be dissolved as fast as possible, which means that the president must establish unilateral control over the whole state as fast as possible, ideally creating entirely new mechanisms for command, control, and signaling across the entire fabric of state order. Let's take a very cursory look. Security. The essential desideratum of any regime change is unilateral central control of the security forces, mainly the police. In America, the military is normally unarmed and not particularly equipped to resist the police, making the latter the primary focus of power. Also, their command connection to the president is much simpler than that of the police. Unless, as an immediate consequence of the election, the president is not in direct command of every law enforcement officer in the United States, he is not on a success path. Personal and professional loyalties must always be distinguished. Yes, the security forces personally are likely to overwhelmingly support the president, especially in the rank and file. Yet they are sworn forces, and their personal support for the president does not translate easily, if at all, to their professional actions. Both these forces should be used as strongly as possible, creating a new emergency command structure in which loyalty is both personal and institutional. Security forces in a regime change generally cannot be replaced, though units can be disbanded and individuals purged. They can be reorganized in two ways: reusing the old chain of command or creating a new chain of command. As usual, all possible energy must be applied in parallel. Sovereign actors or actors seeking sovereignty should always have unlimited confidence and act as strongly as possible. The way to test a command is to make it a signal. Ideally, within a week, every law enforcement officer in America is wearing a red armband to show that he follows the new president's direct, unconditional command. Forces, units, or individuals who resist this order need to be stripped of their badges immediately. This signal can be ordered either by executive command under emergency authority, or by disorganized personal loyalty, or even by a parallel organization within law enforcement, a wildcat police union. If millions of armbands are hard to rustle up, a subtle signal like a piece of tape will do. Anyone can get tape stuck on their uniform. All these supporters can be organized into a parallel command structure that follows the official hierarchy unless nodes in that hierarchy do not show the signal. Then the new structure's first priority is to route around those nodes. Ubiquitous phones and messaging apps make it very easy to construct effective ad hoc hierarchies. The most drastic form of action, if all top-down operations fail, which is possible in some parts of the nation with strong local resistance to the new regime, is the police strike. This also requires the president to pre-organize his supporters in police departments, either passively through propaganda, actively through a classic cell structure, or virtually through some kind of anonymous app. When the police all agree to do nothing, never implausibly deniable in an era when they do almost nothing, jurisdictions which resist the president's order will realize that they themselves cannot maintain their own order. These cities generally contain or are near centers of criminal culture. Criminals learn quickly that they can pillage with impunity. Eventually, everywhere becomes Chaz after a sufficient dose of this purge. Civilians in these jurisdictions, regardless of their ideology, are quite disinclined to oppose any force capable of restoring order. They would welcome ISIS. No authority should ever be dissolved without a parallel replacement process. After an initial process in which its only purpose is the restoration of order, the new security state needs to return to the restoration of law. Some power besides its own command structure will have to make decisions about what is right or wrong for the cops to do. But again, it is best to replace old habits of power. One way to make sure the new legal system is free from the corruptions of the old is to start with a European legal code based on the Roman civil law. This way, not even former lawyers will have an advantage in the contest for legal authority. There will be a lot of capable people looking for new careers. They should all have a chance to train and test into the law. Information. The mainstream press can and must be abolished within a week. The fabled MSM is just a set of media companies whose quasi-governmental status is blessed by history. History has withdrawn her blessing, and nothing is more fragile than a company. Its doors can be locked, its servers can be seized. Any great nerve center of power, like the old Stasi office, becomes in the next regime a subject for mere investigation. One critical task of any new regime is a complete and devastating understanding of the old regime, just as every new Chinese dynasty wrote the authoritative history of the last dynasty. Imagine writing the story of the 20th century through the internal records of the New York Times. It will be done. Nothing is more fragile than a company, yet nothing is more resilient than a market. Eradicating the production infrastructure of some product is ultimately useless until the demand is eradicated as well. Unless the desire for a product is eradicated along with its factories, the product will return. Capitalism will find a way. And the infrastructure in journalism and education is not organizational structure or even brand loyalty, but human capital. Like it or not, these businesses employ many talented and energetic Americans. The president does not feel like executing them. Maybe they should be happy about this, but they won't be. Even after the irreversible corporate liquidation of all their bases, nests, and hives, the journalists remain as a capable, if temporarily disorganized, army in the field. After their initial defeat by sovereign force, they must be finished off by market forces, eliminating the demand for anything which smells like 20th century journalism. Otherwise, these termites, with the plagues they carry, will burrow right back in. Under the old regime, people read the New York Times for three reasons. It made them feel like good people who matter. It had the latest, most reliable information about the world, and it had the best writers. If the president wants the New York Times, by any name, under any ownership, to not exist, to have no reason to exist, all these market forces have to be nullified and defeated. This means only that the state media agency of the new regime can compete with the scattered remnants of old regime journalism, not that it has to win, but just by being better, it can win, which is not at present the case for an NYT competitor. Yet this outlet should ideally come into existence long before a new regime is born. Under the new regime, there are no leaks. Rather, media and intelligence are unified. The government makes sure it always knows the truth and says as much of it as it can. Under the new regime, reading the old party line does not make anyone feel good and powerful. Since the old regime is irreversibly dead, the party line is no longer aligned even with potential power. And the new regime can hire even better talent writers who lack the weird old stench of 20th century ideology. Power out of power smells. Consider the fate of Wikipedia under the new regime. Wikipedia is by far the most important source of neutral information on the planet, and also deeply infected with the woke mind virus, as some call it. Does the new regime seize Wikipedia.org, B fork Wikipedia and produce something better, or C both? Obviously, whenever you have to ask. An effective, well-funded Department of Information should be able to edit a much better public encyclopedia than a bunch of Reddit amateurs in their pajamas. But the Reddit amateurs have all the inertia in the world behind them. But no one, not even Wikipedia, is exempt from the sovereign exception. If the inertia of the mere domain name is captured, and then the new management is superior in every way, the old staff will be defeated. So long as new regime Wikipedia is actually a better encyclopedia than the refugee editors of old Reddit Wikipedia can create, any rebel fork will suffer the fate of all forks. The bums will always lose. Do you believe in the unitary executive? Does your unitary executive have a plan to fork Wikipedia? No? Then he isn't thinking big enough. He shouldn't even get a chance to try. He will just lose and make the problem harder. Americans are too attracted by the idea of spontaneous order replacing sovereignty. Spontaneous order, like the benign Darwinian competition of capitalist economics, is a tremendously useful tool of sovereignty. But it is only a tool. To cede sovereignty to a spontaneous order is an incorrect, damaging, and ineffective use of the tool. To cede sovereignty to Wikipedia is simply to corrupt Wikipedia with power. Across our entire society, spontaneous orders have been granted power and thus have been corrupted by power. To uncorrupt them is not to grant them more power, but for power to bring them into order, thus taking the ambition that corrupts them away. Anarchy is always the enemy of liberty. Declaring the official truth is an essential attribute of sovereignty which cannot be removed, and this leads directly to the conclusion that every sovereign country should maintain its own Wikipedia fork, in which it should decide on its own official truth. The truer, obviously, the better. Of course, journalism is just one category of education. While education and even religion are long-term responsibilities of the government, they are not immediate needs in the same way as, say, nutrition. The exception is their function as daycare, for which we can do what we did during COVID. If you are a caregiver who needs to stay home because schools are closed, you should get your current salary to homeschool at least until the new schools are spun up. Apart from a few effective research laboratories in highly applied fields, chemistry, medicine and biology, mathematics, materials science, and the like, none of the educational establishment, from kindergarten to grad school, needs to be preserved. Even the brand names of the institutions can be canceled. Some of the buildings are nice, but not really nice enough to be worth the risk of keeping. All the records must be preserved and processed in a central database. It still matters that you got a degree from Harvard in 2017, even long after there is no Harvard. And as for the minor league sports teams, they can just be minor league sports teams. Just because the university system is ground to fine dust doesn't mean there's no March Madness. Of course, education is good and necessary. Replacing America's education, selection, research, and credentialing infrastructure is essential. But it is essential on the scale of months, not weeks, and as in almost all governments, creating a new system will be much easier than repairing the old system. A reboot, not a reform. Actual system software experts, such as myself, have a term for changing running code without a reboot. We call it a monkey patch. This may be disrespectful to our primate friends. Finance. As soon as possible, the president takes unilateral control of the Federal Reserve. Like the rest of the administrative state, the Fed is clearly subject to the executive branch. Total power over the Fed, which should be one of the first nodes the new president captures by sudden and determined force, is no more than constitutional government. According to the Constitution, of course, only the Congress can spend money. True, the Fed, however, can create money. And regime change isn't cheap. The Fed also supervises the banks, which control everyone's money. Organizations and persons hostile to the new president will find it hard to operate with their accounts frozen. The American financial system has become a vast mandatory casino which defies the rules of both common sense and good accounting. Reorganizing this casino into something sane is more complex than can be covered here. It involves fixing the supply of money and ensuring that banks match every borrower with a lender. But broadly speaking, it is easy to collapse the whole rickety structure that 20th century electronic finance made out of 19th century paper finance into something simple. Everyone's financial portfolio is automatically sold across the board to the Fed. Also, it is a good time for everyone to stop using paper money. If you have paper money, bring it to a bank this week. Next week, it is just paper. Whatever you have dollars in the Fed. And the Fed owns all financial assets. Your house is sold to the Fed at the Zillow price. Your mortgage is now rent. Your equity is now dollars. You can decline this transaction. You shouldn't, because all assets will be repriced and can be bought back at a lower price. No, this is not the right way to run the whole economy permanently. Capitalism is good. But while this is not the right way to run the economy, it is the right way to reboot the economy. Flattening the financial system this way makes it much easier to control crime, of course, and also any kind of anti-government activity. And in the end, the new financial system should have two features. First, it should not have any business cycles or even long-term price trends. Second, no one who does not have alpha about some market should need or want to gamble in it. The only proper consumer finance product is the CD, a long-term loan to the bank. The stock market should be a zero-sum game in which good predictors profit from bad predictors, not a quasi-mandatory public casino. One essential sovereign tool in any regime change is financial prescription, the confiscation of large pools of private wealth that would otherwise oppose the new regime. Some of this wealth is institutional, some is individual. At a certain level, money is power. No concentration of surviving old regime power can be ignored. In a regime change, it goes without saying that philanthropic foundations, unless narrowly focused on some specific and deeply apolitical problem, are treated as arms of the state. As such, their assets are forfeited to the USG, and they must accept the direction of the president, who directs them to shut down their offices, give him all their data and records, and put all their staff on federal severance. And if they try to ignore these orders, their credit cards stop working and their lights are turned off. If only this was enough to solve the problem. Alas, the sovereign exception has to go even farther. In fact, most billionaires are progressives. Is this a good thing? Of course, it's not a good thing. $1 billion is a big number, but it's just a number in the computer. The president, being sovereign, has root access to that computer. At a certain level, money is power. Hey, billionaire, how did you earn your money? We know one thing: it was under the old regime. Maybe it was honestly, maybe it wasn't. Let's assume it was. So you deserve to be rich. How rich do you deserve to be? 50 mil? If screening the HNOIs for their ideology is too tough, just impose an 8-figure cap on everyone. Because at a certain level, money is power. Be thankful you're not in Rome. In Rome, prescription meant you would have been killed with your family. Personnel. Rightists tend to obsess about the lack of startup quality right-wing staff. TLDR, this is true, but does not matter in a new executive branch. In an oligarchy, personnel is policy. In a monarchy, personnel execute policy. The CEO actually is in charge of the organization. I know this is hard to imagine for people who have not worked in the private sector. It does not matter what the king's man says to himself in the shower, it matters what he says in the meeting. And if it isn't an effective way to execute the king's policy, why would he say it in the meeting? In a bureaucracy, policy is personnel, the ideology of the organization is the ideology of its staff. But in a true executive monarchy, policy is not personnel. The CEO actually runs the organization. I know this is hard to imagine for people who have not worked in the private sector. Generally, the libs are not truly true believers, just power addicts. In Nazi Germany, they would be the biggest Nazis lining up Apple swastikas on the teacher's desk. To ask whether you have power yet is to ask whether the power addicts support you yet. After the fall of the Reich, they became the biggest Democrats or communists around. If Hitler comes back to life, they will be once again in the front row hiling. Power addicts should not be in charge of anything. They should not be sovereign. But when they are in a functional command structure, one in which maximizing their own personal power and being an effective subordinate are the same problem, nothing at all is wrong with using them. The lesson of the ideological reconstructions of Germany and Japan is that public opinion responds to power even without being repressed. Since in general, the only reason there is a public opinion, the only reason people care about government policy is the voyeuristic, pornographic, addictive feeling of domination that they feel from supporting some cause, they will not support any obviously impossible cause. A cause that visibly has no chance of succeeding, has no way to make anyone high or hard. In any rapid, firm, coordinated, and effective regime change, resistance will seem hopeless while the old regime is still being taken apart. Once it is fully dismantled, the prospect of somehow reassembling it will be still more daunting. Finally, once the new regime has universally demonstrated the incompetence of the old regime, both through historical re-education and by its own vastly superior performance, any remaining interest in reversing the transition will belong to antiquarian cranks. There are still people today who want to restore the Holy Roman Empire or COVID masks or something. What TFs? The new regime is not even right-wing, because right-wing does not mean anything but opposition to left-wing. In the absence of left-wing, it is not that everything is right-wing, nothing is right-wing, because no opposing force is necessary. Whether rightists understand this or not, generally not, the only rational telos of rightism is the restoration of a stable, responsible, and accountable monarchy in which the destabilizing energies that create leftism do not even exist. In this context, rightism and leftism both will only remain as academic and historical tropes like Catharism or Lollardy. The unitary executive and the bareback president. Creating the conflict. Caesar was a populist, but populism died with Caesar.is. This what say John Yu wants? I think not, which is why I coined my own ribald term. It is ribald because laughter disrupts the sacred. It is curious to contemplate the mindset of the voter who would support one but not the other. Why? Imagine the Trump voter who wants to give Trump power but not. Definitely not. Too much power, definitely not the power to do this. He wants to be with Trump. He loves Trump. But not that way, not without protection. Please. Who is this abject boomer? How is he still alive and still believing in some kind of Norman Rockwell America? Get this man some stem cells and just harvest his vote? The rest of us like to fuck, we're tired of fucking a balloon. If it's not a bareback election, it's a sterile election. When else are we going to reverse our constitutional vasectomy? Will some foreigner have to finally do the deed? Will America have kids with the bull? Will we let ourselves decline this way until some Putin or Xi is ready to step in? The right is not the only option. We can imagine a bareback president coming from the left. If you are a Republican, you have unboomered yourself indeed if you can see the reality that this regime would not even be that different. The rule that structure drives ideology is true even at the executive level. True fact, President Bukele himself, peace be upon him, came from the post-communist Salvadoran left, the FMLN. Once the bareback president is secure, he is always president of the whole country, and the cold civil war ends, just as Caesar and Augustus ended the conflict of the orders in Rome. The mere structure of the old republic was on myths and revolutions. The essential problem with the David Velazco worldview, as with many recovering progressives, Velazco seems to be some kind of neo-IDW type, always ready to believe that real liberalism has never been tried. No, baby, it's real fascism that has never been tried, is that his reconsideration of his narrative is historically skin deep. Velazco is perfectly ready to admit he knows perfectly well from his real personal life experience that his entire present world is deeply marinated in deeply false and meretricious political narratives. He knows, as Orwell did, what a struggle it can be even for the smartest and best informed of us to see the noses in front of our faces. In the present, Velazco has shed his creepy, pornographic political romanticism and perhaps learned to see the world as it is. This is the real achievement of a truly mature intellectual. But in the past, he and his ilk remain in the grip of simplistic myths that should not confuse a child. These myths are constantly getting away. For example, he is a big fan of the American Revolution. I find the calamity and death that comes with many revolutions, as well as their attendant ideological justifications, nothing less than evil. But other revolutions I support. There was no widespread or systematic execution of the British in the wake of the American Revolution. Do you not also see that revolutions vary in type and moral value, or do you think any upheaval of the status quo is more harmful than the alternative? No widespread or systematic execution is a hell of a standard. COVID doesn't put everyone on a ventilator either, so everyone should get COVID? I assert that Velazco, like 99.999% of Americans, and in fact basically everyone in the world today, knows nothing about the American Revolution. Nothing. He is attached to a mere legend. He might as well get his political examples from the Book of Mormon and start talking about what the Nephites did to the Lamanites or something. For example, did you ever notice that there is over a decade between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? You probably know that the United States did indeed exist between 1776 and 1789. You probably even know the name of the first Constitution of the United States by that name, the Articles of Confederation. This period was more than just a decade, it was an entire American regime, and it was the regime actually created by the Revolution, and it has been totally airbrushed out of history. How can you support the revolution but know nothing at all about the regime it resulted in? What is wrong with you? Head injury? Here is an exercise. Name anyone outside the military who was associated with the Articles of Confederation government, the Congress of the Confederation. Now say something about him. If you got one of these right, you are a trivia nerd. If you got both right, you are a historian. In the public narrative, this period is just gone. It really is like you had a head injury. The truth, to make a really long story really short, is that while the ideologies of the 1770s did not result in any widespread or systematic execution. Imagine the FDA approving revolution therapy because it does not always entirely kill the patient. They resulted in a regime that did not work, and that had to be replaced in America's first radical right-wing coup by Hamilton's quasi-monarchical constitution. whose basic thrust was to install the commanding general of the revolution as a temporary king. Do you know who did know something about the American Revolution? Try John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Do you know what they said about it in their famous exchange of letters late in life? Jefferson wrote, "On the subject of the history of the American Revolution, you ask who shall write it? Who can write it? And who will ever be able to write it? Nobody." Adams responded, "Indeed, I have been so little satisfied with histories of the American Revolution that I have long since ceased to read them. The truth is lost in adulatory panegyrics and vituperative insolence." Strangely, Adams and Jefferson, lifelong political adversaries, both have the same problem as Velasco with the narrative of their own times. Everything is propaganda. They have their choice between propaganda lines, but truth is nowhere on the menu. Then, though, they both agree that a history by an Italian writer, Carlo Botta, is pretty good. Try reading it. You may find you've stumbled on an unknown world. Botta uses the style of Thucydides. He invents speeches representing the positions of both sides. The actual speech is being lost. He is not as good as Thucydides, maybe, but Thucydides is pretty damn good. Botta is a moderate Napoleonic liberal. Adams and Jefferson are both liberals too. None of them is actually a Tory. If you want a Tory view of the American Revolution, neighbor, do I have two books for you: Sidney Fisher's True History of the American Revolution 1903 and Peter Oliver's Origin and Progress of the American Rebellion 1781. While their perspective does differ, you will find that they still resonate with Botta. Reading both sides of the war in this way, you will realize that your previous opinion on the American Revolution is an opinion about a legend that never happened. What did happen is interesting too. I usually summarize it as the Vietnam War in the 18th century. It has nothing to do with the lessons we are taught to draw from the legend. In so plainly a worldly, wise, and mature man, where does this attraction to children's stories and historical myths come from? Embarrassingly, Velasco tries to pin it on Carlyle himself. For me, one of the best criticisms of Carlyle comes from a phrase he coined himself, namely the everlasting no, which was his name for disbelief in God, to oversimplify the matter. But it is more than this. The everlasting no is a rejection of the sublime in life, a rejection of the sacred in humanity. It is what would allow someone to think we should perhaps retry slavery or dictatorship, or even worse, it is taking pleasure in mocking and jeering at things of the highest value, such as freedom from chains, as if they are only valued by insipid fools who know no better. No, Velasco, you insufferable midwit, by the everlasting no, Carlyle meant the common refusal to accept the climate of universal mendacity and its resultant eternal bureaucratic stasis and no, which prevented his complacent Victorian England from embracing the proactive radical political change he knew was necessary, or which I think I know is necessary, and his alternative is nothing, the status quo. And his alternative is not even nothing but what Carlyle called shams lies, like the historically ridiculous idea that the American Revolution had something to do with freedom from chains. One practically expects him to break out into a Dr. King's speech or even say something about George Floyd. The virus is still at work. No, here is a better Carlyle quote on shams from his great essay on the revolutions of 1848. What can be more miserable than this universal hunting out of the high dignitaries, solemn functionaries, and potent grave and reverend signors of the world, this stormful rising up of the inarticulate dumb masses everywhere, against those who pretended to be speaking for them and guiding them? These guides, then, were mere blind men only pretending to see. These rulers were not ruling at all. They had merely got on the attributes and clothes of rulers and were surreptitiously drawing the wages while the work remained undone. The kings were sham kings, play acting as at Drury Lane, and what were the people with that took them for real? It is probably the biggest disclosure of falsity in human things that was ever at one time made. These reverend dignitaries that sat amid their far-shining symbols and long-sounding, long-admitted professions were mere impostors then? Not a true thing they were doing, but a false thing. The story they told men was a cunningly devised fable. The gospels they preached to them were not an account of man's real position in this world, but an incoherent fabrication of dead ghosts and unborn shadows, of traditions, cants, indolences, cowardices, a falsity of falsities, which at last ceases to stick together. Who that had, for this divine universe, an eye which was human at all, could wish that shams of any kind, especially that sham kings, should continue? No, at all costs it is to be prayed by all men that shams may cease. Good heavens, to what depths have we got, when this to many a man seems strange. Yet strange to many a man it does seem, and to many a solid Englishman, wholesomely digesting his pudding among what are called the cultivated classes, it seems strange exceedingly a mad ignorant notion, quite heterodox, and big with mere ruin. He has been used to decent forms long since fallen empty of meaning, to plausible modes, solemnities grown ceremonial, what you in your iconoclast humor call shams, all his life long never heard that there was any harm in them, that there was any getting on without them. Did not cotton spin itself, beef grow, and groceries and spices come in from the east and the west quite comfortably by the side of shams? Kings reigned, what they were pleased to call reigning, lawyers pleaded, bishops preached, and honorable members perforated, and to crown the whole, as if it were all real and no shame there, did not scrip continue salable, and the banker pay in bullion or paper with a metallic basis. The greatest sham, I have always thought, is he who would destroy shams. The greatest sham, Volodsko and his ilk think, is he who would destroy shams. Does not cotton spin itself and beef grow? Who cares if our cherished founding stories are just myths, and the political lessons we take from them no more than fantasies? Does not cotton spin itself and beef grow? Do not voters vote what they are pleased to call voting? As for the metallic basis, well, in Carlyle's time it was the old monarchs of Europe still clinging on in 1848, who were the sham. The reality was the rising, boiling force of street democracy. In our time, the worm has turned. It is democracy that is the sham covering for oligarchy. Anyone who cannot denounce this lie and fully accept the consequences of the truth that lies behind it, that Americans can only escape from their increasingly awful regime by using democracy to elect a monarch who can destroy the oligarchy, becomes complicit in the lie, however astute his other analysis may be. UBERSOY. Discourse on democracy. Right-wing progressive democracy, or why the way you think about democracy is wrong. Prior to laying out the ideal principles of political organization, it is necessary to provide a short discourse on democracy. The primary unspoken assumption of any democratic theorist is that greater democracy must result in greater agency. Technocracy does not differ in this by a bit. However, it has been an observation of mine that not a single political theorist has been able to dissect democracy into two or more basic components without reference to institutions or groups. Practically all of the political theorists who tilt leftwards regard democratic progress as consisting in perpetually expanding itself to as many people as possible without distinction to the natural and acquired characteristics of the people participating in politics. Meaning they could not theorize the most basic abstract division of democracy, which is the division of democracy into its horizontal quantitative and vertical qualitative components. Horizontality refers to the overall number of people potentially participating in politics, while verticality refers to the required competence level of a potential voter in order to participate in effect. In practice, a democracy that is both highly horizontal and vertical is theoretically open to every single person within the realm, while for a person to express his political will in actuality, they must ascend to a status of a voter by withstanding strong selective pressures that only a few percentage of the population can ever achieve in practice. The opposite of this is a form of democracy with low horizontal and vertical reach, meaning a democracy in which only a small number of people is theoretically able to partake in without having to undergo any quality controls that would demonstrate their level of competence. Unfortunately, due to the innate leftward biases of our political theorists, the qualitative aspect of democracy never becomes acknowledged as anything but a reactionary remnant of the aristocratic old order, yet the old aristocratic order was constructed on the basis of inherited status, as opposed to the basis of competence that can be demonstrated with ability. One-dimensional view of democracy, in effect, got rid of quality controls that must be placed on the voters and reordered the thinking of all major political theorists to be placed upon a single axis of quantity, in which political progress implies expanding access to political participation to everyone, which oftentimes finds itself converging with socialist and universalist moral sentiments, thus becoming mutually self-reinforcing. To argue for a socialist economic model, a socialist often says that the workplace must be organized with the principles of direct democracy, bypassing and abolishing property rights. While a left-wing moralist says that it is our duty to extend our moral compassion to every living being on the planet and beyond, removing any particularist and kin-based attachments in the process. Just as in the realm of politics, these delusions are futile in the sense that they lack qualitative discrimination in favor of a greater function. In effect, every single Western liberal democracy would score high on the quantitative dimension of democracy, yet simultaneously score highly deficient in the qualitative dimension of democracy. Meaning, while there has been a significant progress in the horizontal axis of democracy, it has not been accompanied by an equal progress to the selective dynamics of these new voters to whom democracy was just recently extended. I charge this leftist tendency of preferring quantity over quality with causing greater political dysfunction and inability to ascend to a higher level for the previous innovations in democracy that have resulted in greater agency, have all been generated by a much more highly selected and smaller political constituency. This simple truth can be observed in nature, market organization, and human achievement. Only a fraction of elements in a sphere is responsible for its output and subsequently progressive reorganization. But unfortunately, modern democratic polities are artificially constructed in such a way as to suppress the will of the most competent by forcefully equalizing it with the most incompetent. Doing a similar platitude in the market in which the economic output or monetary weight of every person and their property becomes artificially leveled would equal to the most unthinkable manifestation of evil and incompetence known to nature. But for some weird reason, it is imagined that politics and democracy in particular must operate in accordance to left-wing moral values as opposed to the basic laws that propel all other systems towards progress. How must progress occur in a system where its main drivers become artificially suppressed by the dead weight of the incompetent? How must the political apparatus optimize itself into the direction of greater agency if these incentives never accumulate sufficient weight to transform a system? The answer is simple. It is impossible, for as long as the present democratic order and the elite that sits at the heart of it is not concerned with function, as much as it is concerned with mobilizing left-oriented identity groups for power as the final consequence of horizontal expansion of democracy. Progress is unfeasible by definition. Only when a qualitative change to the managerial apparatus underpinned by adoption of a better moral and epistemological system occurs, a democracy can truly move towards greater function. Keith Woods. Secularism is here to stay. Secularization is deeper than you think. In my essay, Where Do the Children Play?, I argued against the proponents of secularization who argue religion is on an inevitable linear decline in the West. I still stand by most of what I wrote in that article. I do think there will be significant growth in more traditional religious sects relative to the rest of the population. However, on the scale of mass society, I think the proponents of the secularization thesis are basically correct, and there are a few important points to make regarding the limited scope of the return to religiosity I discussed in that essay. Since writing that essay, there are some things I have reconsidered which, if true, seem to place a hard limit on the scope of a return to religiosity. First, the heritability of religion is slightly lower than some oft-cited studies suggest. Secondly, a closer look at religiosity in the U.S. has led me to conclude that its purported exceptionalism is likely overblown. Seeking an explanation for American religiosity is what originally made me sympathetic to the religious marketplace. Argument made by some sociologists of religion, who argue that modernity will lead to a religious revival. Looking at this model more critically, there are a number of problems with the way the supposed evidence for it is presented, and some very noticeable trends in the West seem to fly in the face of the trends this model predicts. In fact, all signs point to pluralism and individualism being at the root of secularization, and if that's the case, the outlook for religion is very grim. Allow me to explain the heritability of religion. Firstly, let's talk about the heritability of religiosity. Opponents of the secularization thesis on the right have made much of this, but it has to be noted that it is often exaggerated. In the past, as a future country, Ed Dutton draws on a 2008 study by Bradshaw and Ellison to argue the genetic heritability of religion is 0.4.1. This study measured the genetic and environmental effect on a number of religious measures, and while markers of conservative religiosity, like biblical literalism, were as high as 0.44, genetic involvement with organized religion and church attendance were a bit lower at 0.32. Religious salience, or religion being an important part of someone's life, was just 0.27 genetic. This study was included in a meta-analysis of studies on the genetic influence on religion produced in 2020. This study breaks down the categories of religiosity into internalized and externalized religiosity. Externalized religiosity is someone's tendency to attend religious services, take part in religious study groups, etc., while internalized religiousness reflects the extent of religious beliefs and the importance of religion in someone's life. Externalized religiousness is more genetic, estimated at 0.39, but this is a measure of how people that are already religious practice their religion. The more relevant category, if we are to forecast how much religiosity will be passed on genetically, is internalized religiosity, and this is found to be 28% genetic. Religion has a lot more to do with genetics than most would ever consider, but it's not large enough to think the religious segments of the population will overtake the non-religious anytime soon, even with greater birth rates. And especially if secularization is having a greater effect than ever on the 72% of the equation that is environmental. The scale of secularization. The secularization thesis argues that religious authority and influence declines in all aspects of social life when exposed to the forces of modernity. This should be applied specifically to the West, since not all societies have undergone the same process of rationalization that has played out in the West since at least the Enlightenment. For various reasons, we shouldn't make the mistake of extrapolating the endurance of religion in the Middle East or Africa to the West. Looking at global numbers of religiously affiliated people, it's easy to see how someone could dismiss talk of secularization. Not a single country in Africa, North America, or the Middle East have a majority secular population. Uruguay is the sole country in the Americas where a majority of the population are religiously unaffiliated. But what secularization really looks like is indifference. In many European countries, a majority still nominally identify as Christian, but church attendance is extremely low and declining, and Christian moral teaching has less influence than ever on society. Politics in European countries, where a majority still identify as Christian, is mostly free of Christian influence, with the church's moral teachings absent from policy debates or election campaigns. Fewer than 20% of people attend a weekly church service in countries like Germany, France, and Spain, and that number is under 10% in Northern European countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In conservative Russia, the number is only 7%. Only 6% of people in the UK engage in daily prayer, and only 9% of Germans. To make matters worse, in Europe, this is heavily skewed to the older segment of the population who grew up in a more religious world and will decline more as that generation dies. The not-so-exceptional exceptions. Opponents of the secularization thesis often point to countries in Eastern Europe that have seen a revival of religiosity in recent decades, but most of these countries are former republics of the Soviet Union, where religion was aggressively repressed by the state. As such, the low levels of religion reported before the 1990s were not the result of modernization, but the numbers being artificially depressed by the actions of the state. What has happened since is just a reflection of the existing religiosity of the people in those states, but this does not mean they will be any more immune to the effects of modernization with time. Indeed, in many of these countries, we are already seeing a rapid decline in religiousness. In a decade from 2011 to 2021, the percent of Polish people identifying as Catholic fell from 88% to 71%. The fraction that attend weekly Mass fell from 58% before 2005 to 39% in 2024. The US may not be so exceptional either. Although Americans are more religious than their European counterparts, by all metrics, Christianity is still on the decline, and it is more marginalized as a political force than ever. And to the surprise of many sociologists, the United States has remained stubbornly religious, with 68% still identifying as Christian. Yet when polled, only 38% of Americans say they consider abortion morally wrong, something obviously at odds with any Christian faith. Only 29% now say they oppose gay marriage. One thing that skewed data on American religiosity is that Americans simply lie more when polled about their church attendance. In the early 1990s, a team of sociologists set out to discover why reported church attendance remained the same, despite the fact that those surveyed also consistently reported that they attended less frequently. Studying the real attendance of congregations in Ashtabula County, Ohio, they concluded the observance claimed by respondents was 83% higher than their best estimates of actual attendance. Further research conducted across the United States concluded church attendance was probably about half of what was being self-reported. Responding to this work, a consensus emerged of about 20% of Americans actually attending a church service weekly, making the U.S. seem much less of an anomaly compared to Europe. But now the number is far lower still. While 21% to 30% still self-report attending church weekly, this year the Washington Post put together a team of data analysts to study the U.S. religious census, who conclude that the rate of weekly attendance was a dismal 5%. Devin Pope, an economist at the University of Chicago, used cell phone data to track where people actually were at church time and also concluded the number was likely 5%, though perhaps as high as 6% if accounting for groups like Orthodox Jews and Amish who would not have cell phones to track. Aside from the numbers identifying as Christian, the U.S. seems unique from Europe in how strong a role Christianity played in its politics, especially since the emergence of the moral majority in the 1970s. Yet the emergence of a stronger Christian right has led to few legislative achievements and has failed in its quest to reverse the trend of secularization in the country. Laws around homosexuality and the secularization of education continue to favor the liberal social agenda. The American divorce rate climbed to one of the highest in the world. Taboos against deviant sexual lifestyles, out of wedlock births, and abortion declined, and the country accepted gay marriage. When religious conservatives finally achieved a big victory with the overturning of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision on abortion, voters rejected abortion bans in referendums in red states like Kentucky and Kansas. By now, the public has so roundly rejected abortion restrictions that Donald Trump has felt the need to emphasize a moderate stance on abortion and promise not to legislate a ban. Modernity vs. religion. The reasons for secularization in the West are numerous, and each one could be and is the topic of its own book. There are deep roots in the theology of Christianity, monotheism replacing animism and removing a spiritual background to things people took for granted, the consistent and clear demands and moral order of a single God encouraging rationalism. Christian nominalism making naturalism seem like a plausible alternative to God. All these have been put forward as explanations for the West's eventual embrace of secularism. These all have their place, but the more immediate causes of secularization are the revolutionary economic and social changes that have come since the Industrial Revolution. The main effect of these changes, which has been particularly devastating to religion, is individualism. Religion is now elective in a way it wasn't in other epochs. Society has become complex and stratified in a way that has disrupted older forms of community where religion and the authority of elders was more taken for granted. Religion thrives in small, close-knit communities. It disintegrates among the masses. As Steve Bruce writes, as the society rather than the community becomes the locus of the individual's life, so religion is denuded. The parish church of the Middle Ages christened, married, and buried. Its calendar of services mapped onto the seasons. It celebrated and legitimated local life. In turn, it drew strength from being frequently reaffirmed by the local people. In 1898, almost everyone in my village celebrated the harvest by bringing tokens of their produce to the church. In 1998, a very small number of people in my village, only one of them a farmer, celebrated by bringing to the church vegetables and tinned goods, many of foreign provenance, bought in a supermarket that was itself part of a multinational combine. Instead of celebrating the harvest, the service thanked God for all his creation. The individualism and complexification of mass society also exposes people to the astonishing pluralism of religious belief. By far, the strongest factor propping up religion historically is that the vast majority of its practitioners just took it for granted. This is not possible for most when they become aware that their religion is one of many, that there are various similar and competing branches of their own religion, that some profess no religion at all, that some have their own form of spirituality or selective religious belief, etc. Most people who were raised in a religious household probably remember a time at which they realized there were competing views about God and the universe, and what their parents had taught them suddenly lost its taken-for-grantedness. While many sustain the faith of their birth through this challenge, many do not. This was not a trial faced by most of our ancestors, who spent their lives in communities of like-minded kin, worshiping the same God and attending the same church. This exposure to pluralism is exacerbated by the advancing communications technology. This is more of a problem for Christianity than other religions. While religions like Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism are compatible with a perennialist or religious pluralist view, many pathways to one summit, Christianity makes a claim to be the one correct path to God. For many, it is difficult to hold the idea that most of the world faces either eternal damnation or a denial of God's infinite love by accident of birth, because of faithfulness to their own father's religion, or because of mistakenly reasoning their way to the wrong belief system. While a Taoist can learn about the practices of a Christian or a Muslim and find reflections of the same truth expressed in their own particular religion, a Christian must face up to the enormous pluralism of faiths and contend that they are all wrong. They must affirm that they alone are correct and have the one right way to God. There is also the simple fact that modernization has made most of us wealthier, healthier, and more comfortable than our recent ancestors could have imagined. Religious belief is increased by mortality salience, and in a world where there are few material consolations for the average person, and death is far more present and visible, religion is a beautiful consolation. Christianity now is not just competing against Islam, Buddhism, and New Age spirituality. It is competing against all the enjoyments, distractions, sports, self-help philosophies, and adventures that modern technological society can offer. A religious philosopher can argue that these are all just so many distractions to fill the God-shaped hole in the hearts of moderns, but how many will listen when that too has to compete with the rest of the attention economy? The free market failure. As mentioned, I previously drew on the supply side or rational choice model of religion promoted by Rodney Stark, one of the greatest sociologists of religion. This was sparked by a search to explain the resilience of religion in the United States, but as I've demonstrated, that has been much exaggerated. Still, Stark and other scholars produced a very large body of work to verify this theory, and many of their studies seem convincing. The theory also has some intuitive plausibility. Won't clergy work harder to put butts in seats in a free market where their living depends on it? Stark often cited examples of Catholic parishes in decline, where the local priest or bishop had apparently stopped caring about appealing to the laity due to the comfort of their positions. But there are serious problems with using a rational choice model for something like religion. Most of all, that religious expression is one of the areas of life least commanded by reason. Just go back to the example of the negligent priests. The rational choice model says the clergyman, with a monopoly facing no competition, will lose motivation to attract followers. But obviously a clergyman has a strong sense of a motivation other than self-interest, the same thing that made him give up his self-interest to finding a wife, having a family, pursuing a more lucrative career, etc. There are other careers where we don't assume this kind of thinking applies. We don't expect an experienced, tenured professor to give bad lectures to his students because of his job security. We know someone of that prestige carries a certain pride and passion in their vocation. As for the argument that exercise of rational choice by the laity makes them more likely to return to religion when their options range from a somber Latin Mass to the lively worship of an evangelical church, there is every reason to imagine that this pluralism might have the opposite effect. As I've argued, seeing diversity of religious expressions is more likely to make a rational person suspect they are all wrong in their own unique way than sift through them finding the one they think is right for them. But what about the data presented for this model? One issue is that supply-siders rest on an implicit assumption that the U.S. is uniformly diverse, while actually reporting high religiosity in areas that are locally homogeneous. While religious diversity is high in the U.S. overall, this doesn't have a lot of bearing on the experience of a Mormon growing up in a homogeneous community in Utah, and the more you remove people from these local pockets of religious homogeneity, the more religion seems to decline. After decades of debate about the supply-side model, two sociologists produced a study taking into account 193 different analyses of religious pluralism, of which only 24 seem to support the claim of supply-siders. The authors conclude that the absence of any general positive relationship between pluralism and participation does not bode well for the more general idea that market-like religious competition promotes religious vitality. Putting the sociology papers aside, supply-siders like Stark have been making these predictions of religious pluralism bolstering religion for decades, but what have we observed? The United Kingdom, with its Protestant tradition, open society, and all the religious diversity its racial diversity has brought in recent years, should be seeing a religious renaissance. Yet encountering Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs hasn't pushed more people to try out one of the hundreds of Christian sects on offer. Among young people in Britain coming of age in this pluralist environment, just 2% identify with the Church of England. Within Europe, more pluralist, historically Protestant countries in the north continue to be more irreligious than southern European countries where Catholicism was dominant. If we zoom in further and compare the very similar Baltic countries, Lithuania has by far the highest rates of church attendance. The fraction of Lithuanians who attended church monthly was polled at 30.2%, but just 8% in Estonia. In fact, Estonia, which is the most economically developed of the Baltic states, is one of the least religious countries in the world, but its remaining share of Christians is quite pluralist, with just over 16% belonging to the Orthodox Church and 7.7% to Lutheranism. Lithuania is the most homogeneous religiously, with 3/4 of the population belonging to the Catholic Church. Just 3.75% of Lithuanians belong to the next largest denomination of the Orthodox Church, the pagan non-answer. Many on the radical right affirm the trends identified by theorists of secularization, but argue that the cause is different. Europeans, they say, are naturally rejecting a foreign religion that was never suited to them. As inevitable as it was that they would throw off this foreign desert religion, it is also inevitable they will return to their natural forms of pagan religion. Will the secularization theorists and hopeful Christians both be blown away by a renaissance of paganism? I don't think so. First of all, there are very few pagans, so few that this would not warrant discussion if not for the bullish predictions of a pagan future from dissident thinkers who are worth taking seriously. There are 74,000 pagans in the UK, fewer than 1 in 500. In Ireland, that rate is fewer than 1 in 1,000. 0.3% of Americans identify with some form of paganism or New Age spirituality, but this is obviously a very diverse bunch. There are white nationalist heathens who view their religion as an extension of their politics, feminist Wiccan witches celebrating full moons, eclectic classicists celebrating Hellenic paganism, etc. Even among the already tiny niche of nationalist pagans, there is far more divergence than among all the sects of Christianity. Some worship the Germanic gods, some the Greek. Some think those gods are real and worthy of devotion. Some view them as real spiritual archetypes that can influence the world. Some are naturalists that view them as metaphors for the forces of nature. Some revere Plato as a sage and the finest exponent of pagan philosophy. Others view Plato as a subversive who destroyed the traditional pagan worldview and helped usher Europeans into the decadent axial age. Paganism is already extremely niche, and it's hard to imagine any one of these niche subsects achieving breakout growth. For many of its adherents, it's hard to know if it really qualifies as a religion at all. Religion isn't just anything people think is really important or find meaning in. Sports, science, transgenderism, or climate change are not actually the new religion. Remember, secularization is not so much about fewer people professing a religion, so much as just becoming indifferent to religion as its authority declines. How many pagans are really under the authority of paganism? Most right-wing pagans seem to decide to be a pagan as a logical next step in their political development. They conclude Europeans need a native, vitalist, moralizing spiritual life, and they choose which type of paganism would be the best fit. Only try as you might to reject reason and empiricism as symptoms of Jewish Christian modernity, you can't really just choose to believe in the gods. If your religion is an attempt at spreading a worldview that you think will moralize people to accomplish the political goals you want, then it's not a religion but a political project. This gets to a more fundamental problem with attempting a return to paganism. Monotheism completely changed how we think about the world, the divine, and our relation to it. The religious scholar Jan Assmann described it as an umbilical cord was severed that cannot be reconnected. There isn't a living tradition of paganism that reconnects us to the rites and traditions of the people who first carried it, and what is paganism if not that? Conclusion. I felt this was a necessary addendum to my other essay on religious trends. However, the main trends I identified there still exist. More conservative people are having more children, while the most left-wing among us are not, and are disappearing fast. States that are ethnically homogeneous, religious, and socially conservative will be able to buck the trend of falling birth rates unlike any others. Smaller, more conservative sects like traditional Catholics and Mormons will grow a lot relative to others. But whatever optimism this might inspire among the religious should be tempered by a reminder that this is happening against a background of collapsing religiosity overall. Not only is society becoming less religious, but religion is losing its political authority. These trends also mean religion will become more fragmented. There will be more thriving sects of homogeneous religious communities, but at the cost of societies where 80% or 90% share one religion with one agreed upon set of morals. Maybe there will be more conservative religious people in the future, but can a smattering of more traditional and fundamentalist Catholics, Mormons, Baptists, and Presbyterians form a cohesive political coalition? The failure of the religious right in the 20th century in countries where the majority of the population shared a faith should make us skeptical. The religiously homogeneous societies of the West in the 20th century were a product of a world where the community was the central locus of authority and meaning. As people became the individuals of mass society, religious authority declined. On the level of mass society, we should expect secularization to continue and religious dialogue to remain isolated from the public square. But on the fringes of mass society, strong religious communities will thrive again. Secularism might be here to stay, but there will be new Byzantiums for those who want to grab a lifeboat.